Chapter 23 of the Olive Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joyce Martin. The Olive Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Chapter 23. The Prince and the Princess in the Forest. There were, once upon a time, a king and queen of Denmark who had an only son, a handsome and clever lad. When he was 18, his father, the old king, fell very ill, and there was no hope that he would ever get well again. The queen and the prince were very unhappy, for they loved him dearly, but though they did all they could, he only grew worse and worse. And one day, when the summer had come and the birds were singing, he raised his head and, taking a long look out of the window, fell back dead. During many weeks the queen could hardly eat or sleep, so sorely did she grieve for him, and the prince feared that she would die also if she went on weeping. So he begged her to go with him to a beautiful place that he knew of on the other side of the forest, and after some time she consented. The prince was overjoyed and arranged that they should set off early next morning. They traveled all day, only stopping now and then to rest, and already the queen began to be better and to take a little interest in the things she saw. Just as the evening was coming on, they entered the forest. Here it was quite dark, for the trees grew so close together that the sun could not shine through them, and very soon they lost the path and wandered helplessly about, wondering what they should do. "If we sleep in this dreadful place," said the queen, who was tired and frightened, "the wild beasts will eat us," and she began to cry. "Cheer up, mother," answered her son. "I have a feeling that luck is coming to us." And at the next turning they came to a little house, in the window of which a light was burning. "Didn't I tell you so?" cried the prince. "Stay here a moment, and I will go and see if I can get food and shelter for the night." And away he ran as fast as he could go, for by this time they were very hungry, as they had brought very little food with them and had eaten up every scrap. When one takes a long journey on foot, one does not like to have too much to carry. The prince entered the house and looked about him, going from one room to the other, but seeing nobody and finding nothing to eat, at last, as he was going sorrowfully away, he caught sight of a sword and shirt of mail hanging on the wall in an inner room, with a piece of paper fastened under them. On the paper was some writing, which said that whoever wore the coat and carried the sword would be safe from all danger. The prince was so delighted at the sight that he forgot how hungry he was, and instantly slipped on the coat of chain armor under his tunic and hid the sword under his cloak, for he did not mean to say anything about what he had found. Then he went back to his mother, who was waiting impatiently for him. "What have you been doing all this time?" she asked angrily. "I thought you had been killed by robbers." "Oh, just looking around," he answered. "But though I searched everywhere, I could find nothing to eat." "I am very much afraid that it is a robber's den," said the queen. "We had better go on, hungry though we are." "No, it isn't, but still we had better not stay here," replied the prince, "especially as there is nothing to eat. Perhaps we shall find another house." They went on for some time until, sure enough, they came to another house, which also had a light in the window. "We'll go in here," said the prince. "No, no, I'm afraid," cried the queen. "We shall be attacked and killed. It's a robber's den. I am sure it is." "Yes, it looks like it, but we can't help that," said her son. "We have had nothing to eat for hours, and I'm nearly as tired as you." The poor queen was indeed quite worn out. She could hardly stand for fatigue, and in spite of her terror was half anxious to be persuaded. "And there's going to be a storm," added the prince, who feared nothing now that he had the sword. So they went into the house, where they found nobody. In the first room stood a table laid for a meal, with all sorts of good things to eat and drink, though some of the dishes were empty. "Well, this looks nice," said the prince, sitting down and helping himself to some delicious strawberries piled on a golden dish, and some iced lemonade. Never had anything tasted so nice, but all the same, it was a robber's den they had come to, and the robbers, who had only just dined, had gone out into the forest to see whom they could rob. When the queen and the prince could eat no more, they remembered that they were very tired, and the prince looked about till he discovered a comfortable bed with silken sheets standing in the next room. "You get into bed, mother," he said, "and I'll lie down by the side. Don't be alarmed. You can sleep quite safely till morning." And he lay down with his sword in his hand and kept watch until the day began to break. Then the queen woke up and said she was quite rested and ready to start again. "First I'll go out into the forest and see if I can find our road," said the prince. "And while I'm gone, you light the fire and make some coffee. We must eat a good breakfast before we start." And he ran off into the wood. After he had gone, the queen lit the fire, and then she thought she would like to see what was in the other rooms. So she went from one to another, and presently came to one that was prettily furnished, with lovely pictures on the walls, and pale blue curtains, and soft yellow cushions, and comfortable easy chairs. As she was looking at all these things, suddenly a trap-door opened in the floor, and the robber chief came out of the hole and seized her ankles. The queen almost died of fright, and shrieked loudly, then fell on her knees and begged him to spare her life. "Yes, if you will promise me 2 things," he replied. "First, that you will take me home to your country and let me be crowned king instead of your son. And secondly, that you will kill him in case he should try to take the throne from me. If you will not agree to this, I shall kill you." "Kill my own son?" gasped the queen, staring at him in horror. "You need not do that exactly," said the robber. "When he returns, just lie on the bed and say that you have been taken ill, and add that you dreamed that in a forest a mile away there are some beautiful apples. If you could only get some of those apples, you would be well again, but if not, you will die." The queen shuddered as she listened. She was fond of her son, but she was a terrible coward, and so in the end she agreed, hoping that something would occur to save the prince. She had hardly given her promise when a step was heard, and the robber hastily hid himself. "Well, mother," cried the prince as he entered, "I have been through the forest and found the road, so we will start directly we have had some breakfast." "Oh, I feel so ill," said the queen. "I could not walk a single step, and there's only one thing that will cure me." "What is that?" asked the prince. "I dreamed," answered the queen in a faint voice, "that a mile away there is a forest where the most beautiful apples grow, and if I could have some of them, I should soon be well again." "Oh, but dreams don't mean anything," said the prince. "There is a magician who lives near here. I'll go to him and ask for a spell to cure you." "My dreams always mean something," said the queen, shaking her head. "If I don't get any apples, I shall die." She did not know why the robber wanted to send the prince to this particular forest, but as a matter of fact it was full of wild animals who would tear to pieces any traveler who entered it. "Well, I'll go," answered the prince, "but I really must have some breakfast first. I shall walk all the faster." "If you do not hurry, you will find me dead when you come back," murmured the queen fretfully. She thought her son was not nearly anxious enough about her, and by this time she had begun to believe that she really was as ill as she had said. When the prince had eaten and drunk, he set off, and soon came to a forest, and sure enough it was full of lions and tigers, and bears and wolves, who came rushing toward him. But instead of springing on him and tearing him to pieces, they lay down on the ground and licked his hands. He speedily found the tree with the apples which his mother wanted, but the branches were so high he could not reach them, and there was no way of climbing up the smooth trunk. "It's no use after all. I can't get up there," he said to himself. "What am I to do now?" But as he turned away, his sword chanced to touch the tree, and immediately 2 apples fell down. He picked them up joyfully and was going away when a little dog came out of a hill close by, and running up to him began tugging at his clothes and whining. "What do you want, little dog?" asked the prince, stooping down to pat his soft black head. The dog ran to a hole that was in the hill and sat there looking out, as much as to say, "Come along with me." "I may as well go and see what is in there," thought the prince, and he went over to the hill, but the hole was so small that he could not get through it. So he thrust his sword into it, and immediately it became larger. "Ha, ha!" he chuckled. "It's worth something to have a sword like that." And he bent down and crept through the hole. The first thing he beheld, when he entered a room at the very end of a dark passage, was a beautiful princess who was bound by an iron chain to an iron pillar. "What evil fate brought you here?" he asked in surprise, and the lady answered, "It isn't much use for me to tell you, lest my lot becomes yours." "I'm not afraid of that. Tell me, who are you, and what has brought you here?" begged the prince. "My story is not long," she said, smiling sadly. "I am a princess from Arabia, and 12 robbers who dwell in this place are fighting among themselves as to which shall have me to wife." "Shall I save you?" asked the prince, and she answered, "Yes, but you can't do it. To begin with, how could you break the chain I am bound with?" "Oh, that's easy enough," said he, taking his sword, and directly it touched the chain, the links fell apart and the princess was free. "Come," said the prince, taking her hand, but she drew back. "No, I dare not," she cried. "If we should meet the robbers in the passage, they would kill us." "Not they," said the prince, brandishing his sword. "But how long have you been here?" he added quickly. "About 20 years, I think," said the princess, reckoning with her fingers. 20 years!" said the prince. "Then you had better shut your eyes, for when you have been sitting there so long, it might hurt you to go too suddenly into the daylight. So you are the Princess of Arabia, whose beauty is famous throughout all the world. I too am a prince. Will you not come back to Arabia and marry me now you have saved my life?" asked the princess. "Even if my father is living still, he must be old, and after his death you can be king." "No," replied the prince, "I cannot do that. I must live and die in my own country. But at the end of a year I will follow you and marry you." And that was all he would say. Then the princess took a heavy ring from her finger and put it on his. Her father's and her mother's names were engraved in it, as well as her own, and she asked him to keep it as a reminder of his promise. "I will die before I part from it," said the prince, "and if at the end of a year I am still living, I will come. I believe I have heard that at the other side of the forest there is a port from which ships sail to Arabia. Let us hasten there at once." Hand in hand they set off through the forest, and when they came to the port they found a ship just ready to sail. The princess said good-bye to the prince and went on board the vessel, and when she reached her own country there were great rejoicings, for her parents had never expected to see her again. She told them how a prince had saved her from the robbers and was coming in a year's time to marry her, and they were greatly pleased. "All the same," said the king, "I wish he were here now. A year is a long time." When the princess was no longer before his eyes, the prince recollected why he had entered the forest and made all the haste he could back to the robber's home. The robber chief could smell the apples from afar, for he had a nose like an ogre, and he said to the queen, "That is a strange fellow. If he had gone into the forest, the wild beast must have eaten him unless he had a powerful charm to protect him. If that is so, we must get it away from him." "No, he has nothing," said the queen, who was quite fascinated by the robber. But the robber did not believe her. "We must think of a way to get it," he said. "When he comes in, say you are well again and have some food ready for him. Then while he's eating, tell him you dreamed that he was attacked by wild beasts, and ask him how he managed to escape from them. After he has told you, I can easily find a way to take his charm from him." Shortly after, the prince came in. "How are you, mother?" he said gaily. "Here are your apples. Now you will soon be well again and ready to come away with me." "Oh, I am better already," said she, "and see, your dinner is all hot for you. Eat it up, and then we will start." While he was eating, she said to him, "I had a horrible dream while you were away. I saw you in a forest full of wild animals, and they were running round you and growling fiercely. How did you manage to escape from them?" "Oh, it was only a dream," laughed the prince. "But my dreams are always true," said his mother. "Tell me how it was." The prince wondered for some time whether he should tell her or not, but at last he decided to let her into the secret. One should tell one's mother everything, he thought, and he told her. "See, mother, here are a sword and a mail shirt which I found in the first house we entered in the forest, and as long as I carry them nothing can hurt me. That is what saved me from the wild beasts." "How can I be thankful enough?" exclaimed the queen, and directly the prince's back was turned, she hurried to tell the robber. The robber, as soon as he heard the news, made a sleeping draught and bade the queen to give it to her son before he went to bed that night. Accordingly, as soon as the prince began to get sleepy, the queen handed him the cup containing the draught. "Drink this to please me," she said. "It will do you good after all you've gone through, and make you sleep well." "What an odd taste it has," murmured the prince as he drank it. Immediately he fell asleep, and the robber came in and took away his sword and shirt of mail. "These things belong to my brother," he said. After he had got them both in his hand, the robber woke him. "I am the master now," said he. "Choose one of two things. Either you must die, or your eyes will be put out, and you will be sent back to the forest." The prince's blood grew cold at these words. Then a thought struck him, and he turned to his mother. "This is your doing?" he asked sternly. And though she burst into tears and denied it, the prince knew she was not telling the truth. "Well," said he, "whilst there is life there is hope. I will go back to the forest." Then the robber put out his eyes, gave him a stick, some food and drink, and drove him into the forest, hoping that the wild beasts would kill him, as he no longer had the sword and shirt to protect him. "Now," he said to the queen, "we will return to your country." The next day they set sail, and as soon as they reached home, they were married, and the robber became king. Meanwhile, the poor prince was wandering about in the forest, hoping to find someone who would help him, and perhaps take him into service, for now he had no money and no home. It so happened that there had been a great hunt in the forest, and the wild beasts had all fled before the hunters and were hiding, so nothing did him any harm. At last one day, just when his food was all gone, and he had made up his mind that he must surely die of hunger, he came to the port whence the ships sailed for Arabia. One vessel was just ready to start, and the captain was going on board when he saw the prince. "Why, here is a poor blind fellow," said he. "No doubt that is the work of the robbers. Let us take him to Arabia with us. Would you like to come, my good man?" he asked the prince. Oh, how glad he was to hear someone speak kindly to him again! And he answered that he would, and the sailors helped him to climb up the side of the ship. When they got to Arabia, the captain took him to the public baths and ordered one of the slaves to wash him. While he was being washed, the princess's ring slipped off his finger and was afterwards found by the slave who cleaned out the bath. The man showed it to a friend of his who lived at the palace. "Why, it's the princess's ring," he said. "Where did it come from?" "It fell off a blind man's finger," said the slave. "He must have stolen it, but I dare say you will be able to return it to the princess." So that evening the man took the ring to the palace and gave it to his daughter, who was the princess's favorite slave, and the girl gave it to her mistress. When the princess saw it, she uttered a cry of joy. "It's the ring I gave my betrothed," she said. "Take me to him at once." The bath-keeper thought it strange that the princess should be betrothed to a blind beggar, but he did as she bade him, and when she saw the prince she cried, "At last you have come! The year is over, and I thought you were dead. Now we will be married immediately." And she went home and told the king that he was to send an escort to bring her betrothed to the palace. Naturally, the king was rather surprised at the sudden arrival of the prince, but when he heard that he was blind, he was very much annoyed. "I cannot have a blind person to succeed me. It's perfectly absurd." But the princess had had her own way all her life, and in the end the king gave way, as he had always done. The prince was taken to the palace with much ceremony and splendor, but in spite of this the king was not contented. Still, it could not be helped, and really it was time the princess was married, though she looked as young as ever. There had been hundreds of knights and princes who had begged her to bestow her hand upon them, but she would have nothing to do with anyone, and now she had taken it into her head to marry this blind prince, and nobody else would she have. One evening, as it was fine, the prince and princess went into the garden and sat down under a tree. Two ravens were perched on a bush nearby, and the prince, who could understand bird language, heard one of them say, "Do you know that it is Midsummer Eve tonight?" "Yes," said the other. "And do you know that part of the garden which is known as the Queen's Bed?" "Yes." "Well, perhaps you don't know this, that whoever has bad eyes or no eyes at all should bathe his eye sockets in the dew that falls there tonight, because then he will get his sight back. Only he must do it between 12 and 1 o'clock. That was good news for the prince and princess to hear, and the young man begged the princess to lead him to the place called the Queen's Bed, which was the little plot of grass where the queen used often to lie down and take her midday nap. Then between 12 and 1 o'clock he bathed his eyes with the dew that was falling there, and found he could see again as well as ever. "I can see you," he said to the princess, gazing at her as if he had never seen anything before. "I don't believe it," she answered. "Well, go and hang your handkerchief on a bush, and if I find it at once you must believe me," he said. And so he did, and he went straight up to the handkerchief. "Yes, indeed you can see," said the princess. "To think that my mother's bed has really given back your sight." And she went to the bank and sat down again, and by, as the day was hot, the princess fell asleep. As the prince watched her, he suddenly saw something shining on her neck. It was a little golden lamp that gave out a bright light, and it hung from a golden chain. The prince thought he would like to examine it more closely, so he unfastened the chain, but as he did so the lamp fell to the ground. Before he could pick it up, a hawk flew in, snatched up the little lamp, and flew away again with it. The prince set off in pursuit and ran on without being able to catch the bird, until at length he had lost his way. Trying to find it, he wandered on, up and down, until he came to the forest where he had found the princess. Meantime the princess woke up, and finding herself alone, she set out to look for him. In the end, she also lost her way, and as she was walking about not knowing what to do, the robbers captured her and took her back to the cave from which the prince had rescued her. So there they were, after all their trouble, no better off than before. The prince wandered on, trying to find his way back to Arabia, until he chanced one day to meet 12 youths walking gaily through the forest, singing and laughing. "Where are you going?" he asked, and they told him they were looking for work. "I'll join you if I may," said the prince, and they answered, "The more the merrier." Then the prince went with them, and they all journeyed on until they met an old troll. "Where are you going, my masters?" said the troll. "To seek service," they told him. "Then come and serve me," he said. "There will be plenty to eat and drink, and not much work to do, and if at the end of a year you can answer 3 questions, I'll give you each a sack of gold. Otherwise you must be turned into beasts." The youths thought this sounded easy enough, so they went home with the troll to his castle. "You will find all that you want here," he said, "and all you need do is take care of the house, for I am going away and shall only return when the year is over." Then he went away, and the young men left to themselves had a fine time of it, for they did no work and only amused themselves with singing and drinking. Every day they found the table laid with good things to eat and drink, and when they had finished, the plates and dishes were cleared away by invisible hands. Only the prince, who was sad for his lost princess, ate and drank sparingly and worked hard keeping the house in order. One day, as he sat in his own room, he heard the voice of the old troll beneath his window talking to another troll. "Tomorrow," said he, "the year is up." "And what questions will you ask?" inquired the other. "First I shall ask how long they have been here. They don't know, the young fools. Secondly, I shall ask what shines on the roof of the castle." "And what is that?" "The lamp that was stolen by me from the princess as she slept in the garden." "And what is the third question?" "I shall ask where the food and drink they consume every day came from. I steal it from the king's table, but they don't know that." The day after, the troll entered. "Now I shall ask my question," said he. "To begin with, how long have you been here?" The young men had been so busy drinking and making merry that they had forgotten all about the agreement, so they remained silent. "1 week," said one at last. "2 months," guessed another, but the prince answered, "1 year." "Right," replied the troll. But the second question was more difficult. "What is it that shines on the roof?" The young man guessed and guessed. "The sun, the moon," but none of them really knew. "May I answer?" asked the prince. "Yes, certainly," replied the troll, and the prince spoke. "The lamp that you stole from the princess whilst she was asleep in the garden." And again the troll nodded. The third question was harder still. "Where does the meat and drink you have had here come from?" None of the young men could guess. "May I say?" asked the prince. "Yes, if you can," replied the troll. "It comes from the king's table," said the prince. And that was all. Now they might take the sacks of gold and go, and the young men went off in such a hurry that the prince was left behind. Presently they met an old man who asked for money. "No, we haven't any," they answered. So they hurried on, and by up came the prince. "Has your lordship a piece of money for a poor man?" asked the old fellow. "Yes," said the prince, and gave him his whole sackful. "I don't want it," said the old man, who was really the troll they had just left, in disguise. "But since you're so generous, here is the princess's lamp, and the princess herself is in the cave where you found her. But how you're going to save her again without the magic sword, I don't know." When he heard that, the prince knew where she was, and that was the beginning of her rescue. So he disguised himself to look like a peddler and traveled on until he reached his own city, where his mother, the queen, and the robber chief were living. Then he went into a goldsmith's shop and ordered a great number of kitchen pots to be made out of pure gold. That was not an order the goldsmith had every day, but the things were ready at last, saucepans and kettles and gridirons, all of pure gold. Then the prince put them in his basket and went up to the palace and asked to see the queen. Directly she heard about the wonderful gold pots and pans, she came out at once and began unpacking the basket and admiring the things. She was so absorbed in them that the prince soon found an opportunity to steal into the bedroom and take the sword and shirt which were hung there, and go back again without his mother having noticed his absence. "The things are all so beautiful," she said. "How much would you take for them?" "Name your own price, your majesty," answered the prince. "I really don't know what to say," said the queen. "Wait till my husband comes back. Men understand such things better. And then, as you are a stranger, he would like to chat with you a little." The prince bowed and waited silently in a corner. Soon after, the robber returned. "Come and see all these lovely gold saucepans," cried the queen. But as the robber entered the room, the prince touched him with the magic sword, and he fell to the ground. "Perhaps now you know me, mother," the prince said, taking off his disguise. "You had better repent for all the wrong you have done me, or your life will be short." "Oh, have mercy!" she cried. "I could not help it. I was so frightened." The prince had mercy. He ordered the wicked king to be stripped of his fine clothes and to be driven into the forest, where the wild beasts tore him to pieces. The queen he sent to her own country. Then he set off for the cave where the princess was sitting chained as before, and with the help of the magic sword he rescued her again without any difficulty. They soon reached the port and set sail for Arabia, where they were married, and till they died, a long while after, they reigned happily over both countries. End of chapter 23. Recording by Joyce Martin.
Chapter 24 of the Olive Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Kukalo. The Olive Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Chapter 24. The Cleaver Weaver. Once upon a time the king of a far country was sitting on his throne, listening to the complaints of his people and judging between them. That morning there had been fewer cases than usual to deal with, and the king was about to rise and go into his gardens, when a sudden stir was heard outside, and the Lord High Chamberlain entered, and inquired if His Majesty would be graciously pleased to receive the ambassador of a powerful emperor who lived in the East, and was greatly feared by the neighbouring sovereigns. The king, who stood as much in dread of him as the rest, gave orders that the envoy should be admitted at once, and that a banquet should be prepared in his honour. Then he settled himself again on his throne, wondering what the envoy had to say. The envoy said nothing. He advanced to the throne where the king was awaiting him, and stooping down, traced on the floor with a rod which he held in his hand a black circle all round it. Then he sat down on a seat that was near, and took no further notice of anyone. The king and his courtiers were equally mystified and enraged at this strange behaviour, but the envoy sat as calm and still as an image, and it soon became plain that they would get no explanation from him. The ministers were hastily summoned to a council, but not one of them could throw any light upon the subject. This made the king more angry than ever, and he told them that unless before sunset they could find someone capable of solving the mystery, he would hang them all. The king was, as the ministers knew, a man of his word, and they quickly mapped out the city into districts, so that they might visit house by house and question the occupants as to whether they could fathom the action of the ambassador. Most of them received no reply except a puzzled stare. But, luckily, one of them was more observant than the rest, and on entering an empty cottage where a swing was swinging of itself, he began to think it might be worth while for him to see the owner. Opening a door leading into another room, he found a second swing, swinging gently like the first, and from the window he beheld a patch of corn, and a willow which moved perpetually without any wind, in order to frighten away the sparrows. Feeling more and more curious, he descended the stairs and found himself in a large light workshop in which was seated a weaver at his loom. But all the weaver did was to guide his threads, for the machine that he had invented to set in motion the swings and the willow pole made the loom work. When he saw the great wheel standing in the corner, and had guessed the use of it, the merchant heaved a sigh of relief. At any rate, if the weaver could not guess the riddle, he at least might put the minister on the right track. So without more ado, he told the story of the circle, and ended by declaring that the person who could explain its meaning should be handsomely rewarded. "Come with me at once," he said. "The sun is low in the heavens, and there is no time to lose." The weaver stood thinking for a moment, and then walked across to a window, outside of which was a hen coop with 2 knuckle bones lying beside it. These he picked up, and taking the hen from the coop, he tucked it under his arm. "I am ready," he answered, turning to the minister. In the hall the king still sat on his throne, and the envoy on his seat. Signing to the minister to remain where he was, the weaver advanced to the envoy, and placed the knuckle bones on the floor beside him. For answer, the envoy took a handful of millet seed out of his pocket and scattered it round, upon which the weaver set down the hen, who ate it up in a moment. At that the envoy rose without a word, and took his departure. As soon as he had left the hall, the king beckoned to the weaver. "You alone seem to have guessed the riddle," said he, "and great shall be your reward. But tell me, I pray you, what it all means." "The meaning, O king," replied the weaver, "is this. The circle drawn by the envoy round your throne is the message of the emperor, and signifies, if I send an army and surround your capital, will you lay down your arms? The knuckle bones which I placed before him told him, you are but children in comparison with us. Toys like these are the only playthings you are fit for. The millet that he scattered was an emblem of the number of soldiers that his master can bring into the field. But by the hen which ate up the seeds he understood that one of our men could destroy a host of theirs. I do not think," he added, "that the emperor will declare war." "You have saved me and my honor," cried the king, "and wealth and glory shall be heaped upon you. Name your reward, and you shall have it even to the half of my kingdom." "The small farm outside the city gates, as a marriage portion for my daughter, is all I ask," answered the weaver, and it was all he would accept. "Only, O king," were his parting words, "I would beg of you to remember that weavers also are of value to a state, and that they are sometimes cleverer even than ministers." End of chapter 24. Recording by Ginger Kukalo.
Chapter 25 of the Olive Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.J. Franck. The Olive Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Chapter 25. The Boy Who Found Fear at Last. Once upon a time there lived a woman who had one son whom she loved dearly. The little cottage in which they dwelt was built on the outskirts of a forest, and as they had no neighbors, the place was very lonely, and the boy was kept at home by his mother to bear her company. They were sitting together on a winter's evening when a storm suddenly sprang up, and the wind blew the door open. The woman started and shivered, and glanced over her shoulder as if she half expected to see some horrible thing behind her. "Go and shut the door," she said hastily to her son. "I feel frightened." "Frightened?" repeated the boy. "What does it feel like to be frightened?" "Well, just frightened," answered the mother. "A fear of something, you hardly know what, takes hold of you." "It must be very odd to feel like that," replied the boy. "I will go through the world and seek fear till I find it." And the next morning, before his mother was out of bed, he had left the forest behind him. After walking for some hours, he reached a mountain which he began to climb. Near the top, in a wild and rocky spot, he came upon a band of fierce robbers sitting round a fire. The boy, who was cold and tired, was delighted to see the bright flames, so he went up to them and said, "Good greeting to you, sirs," and wriggled himself in between the men till his feet almost touched the burning logs. The robbers stopped drinking and eyed him curiously, and at last the captain spoke. "No caravan of armed men would dare to come here. Even the very birds shun our camp. And who are you to venture in so boldly?" "Oh, I have left my mother's house in search of fear. Perhaps you can show it to me." "Fear is wherever we are," answered the captain. "But where?" asked the boy, looking round. "I see nothing." "Take this pot and some flour and butter and sugar over to the churchyard, which lies down there, and bake us a cake for supper," replied the robber. And the boy, who was by this time quite warm, jumped up cheerfully, and slinging the pot over his arm, ran down the hill. When he got to the churchyard he collected some sticks and made a fire. Then he filled the pot with water from a little stream close by, and mixing the flour and butter and sugar together, he set the cake on to cook. It was not long before it grew crisp and brown, and then the boy lifted it from the pot and placed it on a stone while he put out the fire. At that moment a hand was stretched from a grave, and a voice said, "Is that cake for me?" "Do you think I am going to give to the dead the food of the living?" replied the boy with a laugh, and giving the hand a tap with his spoon, and picking up the cake, he went up the mountainside, whistling merrily. "Well, have you found fear?" asked the robbers when he held out the cake to the captain. "No. Was it there?" answered the boy. "I saw nothing but a hand which came from a grave, and belonged to some one who wanted my cake. But I just rapped the fingers with my spoon, and said it was not for him, and then the hand vanished. Oh, how nice the fire is!" And he flung himself on his knees before it, and so did not notice the glances of surprise cast by the robbers at each other. "There is another chance for you," said one at length. "On the other side of the mountain lies a deep pool. Go to that, and perhaps you may meet fear on the way." "I hope so, indeed," answered the boy, and he set out at once. He soon beheld the waters of the pool gleaming in the moonlight, and as he drew near he saw a tall swing standing just over it, and in the swing a child was seated, weeping bitterly. "That is a strange place for a swing," thought the boy, "but I wonder what he is crying about." And he was hurrying on towards the child, when a maiden ran up and spoke to him. "I want to lift my little brother from the swing," cried she, "but it is so high above me that I cannot reach. If you will get closer to the edge of the pool, and let me mount on your shoulder, I think I can reach him." "Willingly," replied the boy, and in an instant the girl had climbed to his shoulders. But instead of lifting the child from the swing, as she could easily have done, she pressed her feet so firmly on either side of the youth's neck that he felt that in another minute he would be choked, or else fall into the water beneath him. So gathering up all his strength, he gave a mighty heave and threw the girl backwards. As she touched the ground, a bracelet fell from her arm, and this the youth picked up. "I may as well keep it as a remembrance of all the queer things that have happened to me since I left home," he said to himself, and turning to look for the child, he saw that both it and the swing had vanished, and that the first streaks of dawn were in the sky. With the bracelet on his arm, the youth started for a little town which was situated in the plain on the further side of the mountain, and as hungry and thirsty he entered its principal street, a Jew stopped him. "Where did you get that bracelet?" asked the Jew. "It belongs to me." "No, it is mine," replied the boy. "It is not. Give it to me at once, or it will be the worse for you," cried the Jew. "Let us go before a judge and tell him our stories," said the boy. "If he decides in your favor, you shall have it. If in mine, I will keep it." To this the Jew agreed, and the two went together to the great hall, in which the Cadi was administering justice. He listened very carefully to what each had to say, and then pronounced his verdict. Neither of the two claimants had proved his right to the bracelet. therefore it must remain in the possession of the judge till its fellow was brought before him." When they heard this, the Jew and the boy looked at each other, and their eyes said, "Where are we to go to find the other one?" But as they knew there was no use in disputing the decision, they bowed low and left the hall of audience. Wandering he knew not whither, the youth found himself on the seashore. At a little distance was a ship which had struck on a hidden rock and was rapidly sinking, while on deck the crew were gathered with faces white as death, shrieking and wringing their hands. "Have you met with fear?" shouted the boy, and the answer came above the noise of the waves. "Oh, help! Help! We are drowning!" Then the boy flung off his clothes and swam to the ship, where many hands were held out to draw him on board. "The ship is tossed hither and thither, and will soon be sucked down," cried the crew again. "Death is very near, and we're frightened." "Give me a rope," said the boy in reply, and he took it and made it safe round his body at one end, and to the mast at the other, and sprang into the sea. Down he went, down, 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 till at last his feet touched the bottom, and he stood up and looked about him. There, sure enough, a sea maiden with a wicked face was tugging hard at a chain which she had fastened to the ship with a grappling iron, and was dragging it bit by bit beneath the waves. Seizing her arms in both his hands, he forced her to drop the chain, and the ship above remaining steady, the sailors were able gently to float her off the rock. Then, taking a rusty knife from a heap of seaweed at his feet, he cut the rope round his waist, and fastened the sea maiden firmly to a stone, so that she could do no more mischief, and bidding her farewell, he swam back to the beach, where his clothes were still lying. The youth dressed himself quickly and walked on till he came to a beautiful shady garden filled with flowers, and with a clear little stream running through. The day was hot, and he was tired, so he entered the gate and seated himself under a clump of bushes covered with sweet-smelling red blossoms, and it was not long before he fell asleep. Suddenly a rush of wings and a cool breeze awakened him, and raising his head cautiously, he saw 3 doves plunging into the stream. They splashed joyfully about and shook themselves, and then dived to the bottom of a deep pool. When they appeared again, they were no longer 3 doves, but 3 beautiful damsels, bearing between them a table made of mother of pearl. On this they placed drinking cups fashioned from pink and green shells, and one of the maidens filled a cup from a crystal goblet, and was raising it to her mouth when her sister stopped her. "To whose health do you drink?" asked she. "To the youth who prepared the cake and wrapped my hand with the spoon when I stretched it out of the earth," answered the maiden, "and was never afraid as other men were. But to whose health do you drink?" "To the youth on whose shoulders I climbed at the edge of the pool, and who threw me off with such a jerk that I lay unconscious on the ground for hours," replied the second. "But you, my sister," added she, turning to the third girl, "to whom do you drink?" "Down in the sea I took hold of a ship, and shook it and pulled it till it would soon have been lost," said she, and as she spoke she looked quite different from what she had done with the chain in her hands, seeking to work mischief. "But a youth came and freed the ship and bound me to a rock. To his health I drink." And they all 3 lifted their cups and drank silently. As they put their cups down, the youth appeared before them. "Here am I, the youth whose health you have drunk. And now give me the bracelet that matches a jewelled band, which of a surety fell from the arm of one of you. A Jew tried to take it from me, but I would not let him have it, and he dragged me before the Cadi, who kept my bracelet till I could show him its fellow. and I have been wandering hither and thither in search of it, and that is how I have found myself in such strange places." "Come with us, then," said the maidens, and they led him down a passage into a hall, out of which opened many chambers, each one of greater splendor than the last. From a shelf heaped up with gold and jewels, the eldest sister took a bracelet, which in every way was exactly like the one which was in the judge's keeping, and fastened it to the youth's arm. "Go at once and show this to the Cadi," said she, "and he will give you the fellow to it." "I shall never forget you," answered the youth, "but it may be long before we meet again, for I shall never rest till I have found Fear." Then he went his way and won the bracelet from the Cadi. After this he again set forth in his quest of Fear. On and on walked the youth, but Fear never crossed his path. And one day he entered a large town, where all the streets and squares were so full of people he could hardly pass between them. "Why are all these crowds gathered together?" he asked of a man who stood next to him. "The ruler of this country is dead," was the reply, "and as he had no children, it is needful to choose a successor. Therefore, each morning one of the sacred pigeons is let loose from the tower yonder, and on whomsoever the bird shall perch, that man is our king. In a few minutes the pigeon will fly. Wait, and see what happens." Every eye was fixed on the tall tower which stood in the center of the chief square, and the moment that the sun was seen to stand straight over it, a door was opened, and a beautiful pigeon, gleaming with pink and gray, blue and green, came rushing through the air. Onward it flew, onward, onward, till at length it rested on the head of the boy. Then a great shout arose, "The king! The king!" But as he listened to the cries, a vision swifter than lightning flashed across his brain. He saw himself seated on a throne, spending his life trying, and never succeeding, to make poor people rich, miserable people happy, bad people good, never doing anything he wished to do, not able even to marry the girl that he loved. "No, no!" he shrieked, hiding his face in his hands, but the crowds who heard him thought he was overcome by the grandeur that awaited him, and paid no heed. "Well, to make quite sure, let fly more pigeons," said they, but each pigeon followed where the first had led, and the cries arose louder than ever, "The king! The king!" And as the young man heard, a cold shiver, that he knew not the meaning of, ran through him. "This is Fear, whom you have so long sought," whispered a voice, which seemed to reach his ears alone. And the youth bowed his head as the vision once more flashed before his eyes, and he accepted his doom, and made ready to pass his life with Fear beside him. End of chapter 25. Recording by M.J. Franck, Portland, Oregon.
Chapter 26 of The Olive Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Olive Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Chapter 26. He Wins Who Waits. Once upon a time there reigned a king who had an only daughter. The girl had been spoiled by everybody from her birth, and, besides being beautiful, was clever and willful, and when she grew old enough to be married she refused to have anything to say to the prince whom her father favored, but declared she would choose a husband for herself. By long experience the king knew that when once she had made up her mind, There was no use expecting her to change it. So he inquired meekly what she wished him to do. "Summon all the young men in the kingdom to appear before me a month from today," answered the princess, "and the one to whom I shall give this golden apple shall be my husband." "But, my dear," began the king, in tones of dismay. "The one to whom I shall give this golden apple shall be my husband," repeated the princess in a louder voice than before. And the king understood the signal, and with a sigh proceeded to do her bidding. The young men arrived, tall and short, dark and fair, rich and poor. They stood in rows in the great courtyard in front of the palace, and the princess, clad in robes of green, with a golden veil flowing behind her, passed before them all, holding the apple. Once or twice she stopped and hesitated, but in the end she always passed on, till she came to a youth near the end of the last row. There was nothing specially remarkable about him, the bystanders thought. Nothing that was likely to take a girl's fancy. 100 others were handsomer, and all wore finer clothes, but he met the princess's eyes frankly and with a smile, and she smiled too, and held out the apple. "There is some mistake," cried the king, who had anxiously watched her progress, and hoped that none of the candidates would please her. "It is impossible that she can wish to marry the son of a poor widow, who has not a farthing in the world. Tell her that I will not hear of it, and that she must go through the rows again and fix upon someone else." And the princess went through the rows a second and a third time, and on each occasion she gave the apple to the widow's son. "Well, marry him if you will," exclaimed the angry king, "but at least you shall not stay here." And the princess answered nothing, but threw up her head, and taking the widow's son by the hand, they left the castle. That evening they were married, and after the ceremony went back to the house of the bridegroom's mother, which, in the eyes of the princess, did not look much bigger than a hen coop. The old woman was not at all pleased when her son entered, bringing his bride with him. "As if we were not poor enough before," grumbled she. "I dare say this is some fine lady who can do nothing to earn her living." But the princess stroked her arm and said softly, "Do not be vexed, dear mother. I am a famous spinner, and can sit at my wheel all day without breaking a thread." And she kept her word, but in spite of the efforts of all three, they became poorer and poorer, and at the end of 6 months it was agreed that the husband should go to the neighboring town to get work. Here he met a merchant who was about to start on a long journey with a train of camels laden with goods of all sorts, and needed a man to help him. The widow's son begged that he would take him as a servant, and to this the merchant assented, giving him his whole year's salary beforehand. The young man returned home with the news, and next day bade farewell to his mother and his wife, who were very sad at parting from him. "Do not forget me while you are absent," whispered the princess as she flung her arms round his neck. "And as you pass by the well, which lies near the city gate, stop and greet the old man you will find sitting there. Kiss his hand, and then ask him what counsel he can give you for your journey." Then the youth set out, and when he reached the well where the old man was sitting, he asked the questions as his wife had bidden him. "My son," replied the old man, "you have done well to come to me, and in return remember 3 things. She whom the heart loves is ever the most beautiful. Patience is the first step on the road to happiness. He wins who waits." The young man thanked him and went on his way. Next morning early the caravan set out, and before sunset it had arrived at the first halting place, round some wells, where another company of merchants had already encamped. but no rain had fallen for a long while in that rocky country, and both men and beasts were parched with thirst. To be sure, there was another well about 1/2 a mile away, where there was always water, but to get it you had to be lowered deep down, and besides, no one who had ever descended that well had been known to come back. However, till they could store some water in their bags of goatskin, the caravans dared not go further into the desert, and on the night of the arrival of the widow's son and his master, the merchants had decided to offer a large reward to anyone who was brave enough to go down into the enchanted well and bring some up. Thus it happened that at sunrise the young man was aroused from his sleep by a herald making his round of the camp, proclaiming that every merchant present would give 1,000 piastres to the man who would risk his life to bring water for themselves and their camels. The youth hesitated for a little while when he heard the proclamation. The story of the well had spread far and wide, and long ago had reached his ears. The danger was great, he knew. But then, if he came back alive, he would be the possessor of 80,000 piastres. He turned to the herald who was passing the tent. "I will go," said he. "What madness!" cried his master, who happened to be standing near. "You are too young to throw away your life like that. Run after the herald and tell him you take back your offer." But the young man shook his head, and the merchant saw that it was useless to try and persuade him. "Well, it is your own affair," he observed at last. "If you must go, you must. Only, if you ever return, I will give you a camel's load of goods, and my best mule besides." And touching his turban in token of farewell, he entered the tent. Hardly had he done so than a crowd of men were seen pouring out of the camp. "How can we thank you?" they exclaimed, pressing round the youth. "Our camels as well as ourselves are almost dead of thirst. See, here is the rope we have brought to let you down." "Come, then," answered the youth, and they all set out. On reaching the well, the rope was knotted securely under his arms, a big goatskin bottle was given him, and he was gently lowered to the bottom of the pit. Here a clear stream was bubbling over the rocks, and, stooping down, he was about to drink, when a huge Arab appeared before him, saying in a loud voice, "Come with me!" The young man rose, never doubting that his last hour had come, but as he could do nothing, he followed the Arab into a brilliantly lighted hall, on the further side of the little river. There his guide sat down, and drawing towards him 2 boys, one black and the other white, he said to the stranger, "I have a question to ask you. If you answer it right, your life shall be spared. If not, your head will be forfeit, as the head of many another has been before you. Tell me, which of my 2 children do I think the handsomer?" The question did not seem a hard one, for while the white boy was as beautiful a child as ever was seen, his brother was ugly even for a Negro. But, just as the youth was going to speak, the old man's counsel flashed into the youth's mind, and he replied hastily, "The one whom we love best is always the handsomest." "You have saved me," cried the Arab, rising quickly from his seat and pressing the young man in his arms. "Ah, if you could only guess what I have suffered from the stupidity of all the people to whom I have put that question, and I was condemned by a wicked genius to remain here until it was answered. But what brought you to this place, and how can I reward you for what you have done for me?" "By helping me to draw enough water for my caravan of 80 merchants and their camels, who are dying for want of it," replied the youth. "That is easily done," said the Arab. "Take these 3 apples, and when you have filled your skin and are ready to be drawn up, lay one of them on the ground. Halfway to the earth let fall another, and at the top drop the 3rd. If you follow my directions, no harm will happen to you. and take, besides, these 3 pomegranates, green, red, and white. One day you will find a use for them." The young man did as he was told, and stepped out on the rocky waste where the merchants were anxiously awaiting him. Oh, how thirsty they all were! But even after the camels had drunk, the skin seemed as full as ever. Full of gratitude for their deliverance, the merchants pressed the money into his hands, while his own master bade him choose what goods he liked, and a mule to carry them. So the widow's son was rich at last, and when the merchant had sold his merchandise and returned home to his native city, his servant hired a man by whom he sent the money and the mule back to his wife. "I will send the pomegranates also," thought he, "for if I leave them in my turban they may some day fall out." And he drew them out of his turban. But the fruit had vanished, and in their places were 3 precious stones, green, white, and red. For a long time he remained with the merchant, who gradually trusted him with all his business, and gave him a large share of the money he made. When his master died, the young man wished to return home, but the widow begged him to stay and help her. And one day he awoke with a start, to remember that 20 years had passed since he had gone away. "I want to see my wife," he said next morning to his mistress. "If at any time I can be of use to you, send a messenger to me. Meanwhile, I have told Hassan what to do." And mounting a camel, he set out. Now, soon after he had taken service with the merchant, a little boy had been born to him, and both the princess and the old woman toiled hard all day to get the baby food and clothing. When the money and the pomegranates arrived, there was no need for them to work any more, and the princess saw at once that they were not fruit at all, but precious stones of great value. The old woman, however, not being accustomed, like her daughter-in-law, to the sight of jewels, took them only for common fruit, and wished to give them to the child to eat. She was very angry when the princess hastily took them from her and hid them in her dress, while she went to the market and bought the 3 finest pomegranates she could find, which she handed the old woman for the little boy. Then she bought beautiful new clothes for all of them, and when they were dressed they looked as fine as could be. Next she took out one of the precious stones which her husband had sent her, and placed it in a small silver box. This she wrapped up in a handkerchief embroidered in gold, and filled the old woman's pockets with gold and silver pieces. "Go, dear mother," she said, "to the palace, and present the jewel to the king, and if he asks you what he can give you in return, tell him that you want a paper, with his seal attached, proclaiming that no one is to meddle with anything you may choose to do. Before you leave the palace, distribute the money amongst the servants." The old woman took the box and started for the palace. No one there had ever seen a ruby of such beauty, and the most famous jeweler in the town was summoned to declare its value. But all he could say was, "If a boy threw a stone into the air with all his might, and you could pile up gold as high as the flight of the stone, it would not be sufficient to pay for this ruby." At these words the king's face fell. Having once seen the ruby, he could not bear to part with it, yet all the money in his treasury would not be enough to buy it. So for a little while he remained silent, wondering what offer he could make the old woman, and at last he said, "If I cannot give you its worth in money, is there anything you will take in exchange?" "A paper signed by your hand and sealed with your seal, proclaiming that I may do what I will, without let or hindrance," answered she promptly. And the king, delighted to have obtained what he coveted at so small a cost, gave her the paper without delay. Then the old woman took her leave and returned home. The fame of this wonderful ruby soon spread far and wide, and envoys arrived at the little house to know if there were more stones to sell. Each king was so anxious to gain possession of the treasure that he bade his messenger outbid all the rest, and so the princess sold the 2 remaining stones for a sum of money so large that if the gold pieces had been spread out, they would have reached from here to the moon. The first thing she did was to build a palace by the side of the cottage, and it was raised on pillars of gold, in which were set great diamonds, which blazed night and day. Of course, the news of this palace was the first thing that reached the king her father on his return from the wars, and he hurried to see it. In the doorway stood a young man of 20, who was his grandson, though neither of them knew it, and so pleased was the king with the appearance of the youth that he carried him back to his own palace and made him commander of the whole army. Not long after this, the widow's son returned to his native land. There, sure enough, was the tiny cottage where he had lived with his mother, but the gorgeous building beside it was quite new to him. What had become of his wife and his mother, and who could be dwelling in that other wonderful place? These were the first thoughts that flashed through his mind, but not wishing to betray himself by asking questions of passing strangers, he climbed up into a tree that stood opposite the palace, and watched. By and by a lady came out, and began to gather some of the roses and jessamine that hung about the porch. The 20 years that had passed since he had last beheld her vanished in an instant, and he knew her to be his own wife, looking almost as young and beautiful as on the day of their parting. He was about to jump down from the tree and hasten to her side, when she was joined by a young man who placed his arm affectionately round her neck. At this sight the angry husband drew his bow, but before he could let fly the arrow, the counsel of the wise man came back to him. Patience is the first step on the road to happiness. And he laid it down again. At this moment the princess turned, and drawing her companion's head down to hers, kissed him on each cheek. A second time blind rage filled the heart of the watcher, and he snatched up his bow from the branch where it hung, when words, heard long since, seemed to sound in his ears. "He wins who waits." And the bow dropped to his side. Then through the silent air came the sound of the youth's voice. "Mother, can you tell me nothing about my father? Does he still live, and will he never return to us?" "Alas, my son, how can I answer you?" replied the lady. 20 years have passed since he left us to make his fortune, and in that time only once have I heard aught of him. But what has brought him to your mind just now?" "Because last night I dreamed that he was here," said the youth, "and then I remembered what I have so long forgotten, that I had a father, though even his very history was strange to me. And now tell me, I pray you, all you can concerning him." And standing under the jessamine, the son learnt his father's history, and the man in the tree listened also. "Oh," exclaimed the youth, when it was ended, while he twisted his hands in pain, "I am general-in-chief, you are the king's daughter, and we have the most splendid palace in the whole world, yet my father lives we know not where, and for all we can guess may be poor and miserable. Tomorrow I will ask the king to give me soldiers, and I will seek him over the whole earth till I find him." Then the man came down from the tree, and clasped his wife and son in his arms. All that night they talked, and when the sun rose it still found them talking. But as soon as it was proper, he went up to the palace to pay his homage to the king, and to inform him of all that had happened and who they all really were. The king was overjoyed to think that his daughter, whom he had long since forgiven and sorely missed, was living at his gates, and was, besides, the mother of the youth who was so dear to him. "It was written beforehand," cried the monarch, "you are my son-in-law before the world, and shall be king after me." And the man bowed his head. He had waited, and he had won. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of the Olive Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ginger Cucolo. The Olive Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. The Steel Cane. Once upon a time there lived an old woman who had a small cottage on the edge of the forest. Behind the cottage was a garden in which all sorts of vegetables grew, and beyond that a field with 2 or 3 cows in it, so her neighbors considered her quite rich and envied her greatly. As long as she was strong enough to work all day in her garden, the old woman never felt lonely. But after a while she had a bad illness, which left her much weaker than before, and she began to think that now and then it would be nice to have some one to speak to. Just at this moment she heard of the death of a shepherd and his wife, who dwelt on the other side of the plain, leaving a little boy quite alone in the world. "That will just suit me," she said, and sent a man over to bring the child, whom she intended to adopt for her own. Now the boy, who was about 12 years old, ought to have considered himself very lucky, for his new mother was as kind to him as the old one. But, unfortunately, he made friends with some bad, rude companions, whose tricks caused him to be a terror to everyone, and the poor old woman never ceased regretting her lost solitude. Things went on in this way for some years, till the boy became a man. Perhaps, if he were to be married he might sober down, she thought to herself, and she inquired among the neighbors what girls there were of an age to choose from. At length one was found, good and industrious, as well as pretty, and as the young man raised no objections, the wedding took place at once, and the bride and bridegroom went to live in the cottage with the old woman. But no change was to be seen in the husband's conduct. All day long he was out amusing himself in the company of his former friends, and if his wife dared to say anything to him on his return home, he beat her with his stick. And next year, when a baby was born to them, he beat it also. At length the old woman's patience was worn out. She saw that it was quite useless to expect the lazy, idle creature to mend his ways, and one day she said to him, "Do you mean to go on like this forever? Remember, you are no longer a boy, and it is time that you left off behaving like one. Come, shake off your bad habits and work for your wife and child, and above all, stop beating them. If not, I will transform you into an ass, and heavy loads shall be piled on your back, and men shall ride you. Briars shall be your food, a goad shall prick you, and in turn you shall know how it feels to be beaten." But if she expected her words to do any good, she soon found out her mistake, for the young man only grew angry and cried rudely, "Bah! Hold your tongue, or I will whip you also." "Will you?" she answered grimly, and swift as lightning she picked up a steel cane that stood in the corner and laid it across his shoulders. In an instant his ears had grown long, and his face longer, his arms had become legs, and his body was covered with close gray hair. Truly he was an ass, and a very ugly one too. "Leave the house," commanded the old woman, and, shambling awkwardly, he went. As he was standing in the path outside, not knowing what to do, a man passed by. "Ho, my fine fellow, you are exactly what I was looking for. You don't seem to have a master, so come with me. I will find something for you to do." And taking him by the ear, he led him from the cottage. For 7 years the ass led a hard life, just as the old woman had foretold. But instead of remembering that he had brought all his suffering on himself, and being sorry for his evil ways, he grew harder and more bitter. At the end of the 7 years his ass skin wore out, and he became a man again, and one day returned to the cottage. His wife opened the door in answer to his knock. Then, letting fall the latch, she ran inside crying, "Grandmother, grandmother, your son has come back." "I thought he would," replied the old woman, going on with her spinning. "Well, we could have done very well without him, but as he is here, I suppose he must come in." And come in he did, but as the old woman expected, he behaved still worse than before. For some weeks she allowed him to do what he liked, then at last she said, "So experience has taught you nothing. After all, there are very few people who have sense to learn by it. But take care lest I change you into a wolf, to be a prey for dogs and men." "You talk too much. I shall break your head for you," was all the answer she got. Had the young man looked at her face he might have taken warning, but he was busy making a pipe and took no notice. The next moment the steel cane had touched his shoulders, and a big gray wolf bounded through the door. Oh, what a yapping among the dogs, and what a shouting among the neighbors as they gave chase! For 7 years he led the life of a hunted animal, often cold and nearly always hungry, and never daring to allow himself a sound sleep. At the end of that time his wolf skin wore out also, and again he appeared at the cottage door. But the second 7 years had taught him no more than the first. His conduct was worse than before, and one day he beat his wife and son so brutally that they screamed to the old woman to come to their aid. She did, and brought the steel cane with her. In a second the ruffian had vanished, and a big black crow was flying about the room, crying, "Grrr! Grrr!" The window was open, and he darted through it, and seeking the companions who had ruined him, he managed to make them understand what had happened. "We will avenge you," said they, and taking up a rope, set out to strangle the old woman. But she was ready for them. One stroke of her cane, and they were all changed into a troop of black crows, and this time their feathers are lasting still. End of the Steel Cane. Recording by Ginger Kukula.
Chapter 28 of the Olive Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joyce Martin. The Olive Fairy Book by Andrew Lang. Chapter 28. The Punishment of the Fairy Gangana. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who ruled over a country so small that you could easily walk round it in one day. They were both very good, simple people, not very wise, perhaps, but anxious to be kind to everybody, and this was often a mistake, for the king allowed all his subjects to talk at once, and offer advice upon the government of the kingdom as well as upon private matters. And the end of it all was that it was very difficult to get any laws made, and still more to get anyone to obey them. Now, no traveler ever passed through the kingdom without inquiring how it came to be so small, and this was the reason. As soon as Petaldo, for that was the king's name, had been born, his father and mother betrothed him to the niece of their friend the fairy Gangana, if she should ever have one. But as the years passed on, and Gangana was still without a niece, the young prince forgot all about his destined bride, and when he was 25 he secretly married the beautiful daughter of a rich farmer, with whom he had fallen violently in love. When the fairy heard the news, she fell into a violent rage, and hurried off to tell the king. The old man thought in his heart that his son had waited quite long enough, but he did not dare to say so, lest some dreadful spell might be thrown over them all, and they should be changed into birds or snakes, or, worst of all, into stones. So much against his will he was obliged to disinherit the young man, and to forbid him to come to court. Indeed, he would have been a beggar had it not been for the property his wife had given her by the farmer, which the youth obtained permission to erect into a kingdom. Most princes would have been very angry at this treatment, especially as the old king soon died, and the queen delighted to reign in his place. But Petaldo was a contented young man, and was quite satisfied with arranging his tiny court in the model of his father's, and having a lord chamberlain, and a high steward, and several gentlemen in attendance, while the young queen appointed her own ladies-in-waiting and maids of honor. He likewise set up a mint to coin money, and chose a seneschal as head of the 5 policemen, who kept order in the capital, and punished the boys who were caught in the act of throwing stones at the palace windows. The first to fill the important office was the young king's father-in-law, an excellent man of the name of Karabasz. He was much beloved by everyone, and so sensible that he was not at all vain at rising at once to the dignity of seneschal, when he had only been a common farmer, but he went about his fields every day as usual. This conduct so struck his king that very soon he never did anything without consulting him. Each morning Karabasz and his son-in-law had breakfast together, and when they had finished, the king took out of his iron chest great bundles of state papers, which he desired to talk over with his seneschal. Sometimes they would spend 2 hours at least in deciding these important matters, but more often after a few minutes Caboci would say, "Excuse me, sire, but your Majesty does not understand this affair in the least. Leave it to me, and I will settle it." "But what am I to do then?" asked the king, and his minister answered, "Oh, you can rule your wife, and see after your fruit garden. You will find that those 2 things will take up all your time." "Well, perhaps you are right," the king replied, secretly glad to be rid of the cares of government. But though Caboci did all the work, Cataldo never failed to appear on grand occasions, in his royal mantle of red linen, holding a sceptre of gilded wood. Meanwhile, he passed his mornings in studying books, from which he learned the proper seasons to plant his fruit trees, and when they should be pruned, and his afternoons in his garden, where he put his knowledge into practice. In the evening he played cards with his father-in-law and supped in public with the queen, and by 10 o'clock everybody in the palace was fast asleep. The queen, on her side, was quite as happy as her husband. She loved to be in her dairy, and nobody in the kingdom could make such delicious cheeses. But however busy she might be, she never forgot to bake a little barley cake, and make a tiny cream cheese, and to put them under a particular rose tree in the garden. If you had asked her whom they were for, and where they went to, she could not have told you, but would have said that on the night of her marriage a fairy had appeared to her in a dream, and had bidden her to perform this ceremony. After the king and the queen had 6 children, a little boy was born with a small red cap on his head, so that he was quite different from his brothers and sisters, and his parents loved Kadiczyn better than any of them. The years went on, and the children were growing big, when one day, after Galette the queen had finished baking her cake, and had turned it out on a plate, a lovely blue mouse crept up the leg of the table and ran to the plate. Instead of chasing it away, as most women would have done, the queen pretended not to notice what the mouse was doing, and was much surprised to see the little creature pick up the cake and carry it off to the chimney. She sprang forwards to stop it, when suddenly both the mouse and the cake vanished, and in their place stood an old woman only a foot high, whose clothes hung in rags about her. Taking up a sharp pointed iron stick, she drew on the earthen floor some strange signs, uttering 7 cries as she did so, and murmuring something in a low voice, among which the queen was sure she caught the words faith, wisdom, and happiness. Then, seizing the kitchen broom, she whirled it 3 times round her head and vanished. Immediately there arose a great noise in the next room, and, on opening the door, the queen beheld 3 large cockchafers, each one with a princess between its feet, while the princes were seated on the backs of 3 swallows. In the middle was a car formed of a single pink shell and drawn by 2 robin redbreasts, and in this car Kadiczyn was sitting by the side of the blue mouse, who was dressed in a splendid mantle of black velvet fastened under her chin. Before the queen had recovered from her surprise, cockchafers, redbreasts, mouse, and children had all flown, singing, to the window, and disappeared from view. The loud shrieks of the queen brought her husband and father running into the room. When at last they made out from her broken sentences what had really happened, they hastily snatched up some stout sticks that were lying about, and set off to the rescue, one going in one direction and the other in another. For at least an hour the queen sat sobbing where they had left her, when at last she was roused by a piece of folded paper falling at her feet. She stooped and picked it up eagerly, hoping that it might contain some news of her lost children. It was very short, but when she had read the few words, Galette was comforted, for it bade her to take heart, as they were well and happy under the protection of a fairy. "On your own faith and prudence depend your happiness," ended the writer. "It is I who have all these years eaten the food you placed under the rose tree, and some day I shall reward you for it." Everything comes to him who knows how to wait, is the advice given by the Fairy of the Fields. Then the queen rose up and bathed her face and combed her shining hair, and as she turned away from her mirror, she beheld a linnet sitting on her bed. No one would have known that it was anything but a common linnet, and yesterday the queen would have thought so too, but this morning so many wonderful things had happened that she did not doubt for a moment that the writer of the letter was before her. "Pretty linnet," she said, "I will try to do all you wish. Only give me, I pray you, now and then, news of my little Kadichin." And the linnet flapped her wings and sang and flew away. So the queen knew that she had guessed rightly, and thanked her in her heart. By and by the king and his seneschal returned, hungry and tired with their fruitless search. They were amazed and rather angry to find the queen, whom they had left weeping, quite cheerful. Could she really care for her children so little and have forgotten them so soon? What could have caused this sudden change? But to all their questions Galette would only answer, "Everything comes to him who knows how to wait." "That is true," replied her father, "and after all, your Majesty must remember that the revenues of your kingdom would hardly bear the cost of 7 princes and princesses brought up according to their rank. Be grateful, then, to those who have relieved you of this burden." "You are right, you are always right," cried the king, whose face once more beamed with smiles, and life at the palace went on as before, till Pataldo received a piece of news which disturbed him greatly. The queen, his mother, who had for some time been a widow, suddenly made up her mind to marry again, and her choice had fallen on the young king of the Green Isles, who was younger than her own son, and besides handsome and fond of pleasure, which Pataldo was not. Now the grandmother, foolish though she was in many respects, had the sense to see that a woman as old and as plain as she was could hardly expect a young man to fall in love with her, and that if this was to happen it would be needful to find some spell which would bring back her youth and beauty. Of course the fairy Gangana could have wrought the change with one wave of her wand, but unluckily the two were no longer friends, because the fairy had tried hard to persuade the queen to declare her niece heiress to the crown, which the queen refused to do. Naturally, therefore, it was no use asking the help of Gangana to enable the queen to take a second husband, who would be certain to succeed her, and messengers were sent out all over the neighboring kingdoms, seeking to find a witch or a fairy who would work the wished-for miracle. None, however, could be found with sufficient skill, and at length the queen saw that if ever the king of the Green Isles was to be her husband, she must throw herself on the mercy of the fairy Gangana. The fairy's wrath was great when she heard the queen's story, but she knew very well that, as the king of the Green Isles had spent all his money, he would probably be ready to marry even an old woman, like her friend, in order to get more. So, in order to gain time, she hid her feelings and told the queen that in 3 days the spell would be accomplished. Her words made the queen so happy that 20 years seemed to fall from her at once, and she counted not only the hours but the minutes to the appointed time. It came at last, and the fairy stood before her in a long robe of pink and silver, held up by a tiny brown dwarf, who carried a small box under his arm. The queen received her with all the marks of respect that she could think of, and at the request of Gangana ordered the doors and windows of the great hall to be closed, and her attendants to retire, so that she and her guests might be quite alone. Then, opening the box, which was presented to her on one knee by the dwarf, the fairy took from it a small vellum book with silver clasps, a wand that lengthened out as you touched it, and a crystal bottle filled with very clear green water. She next bade the queen sit on a seat in the middle of the room, and the dwarf to stand opposite her, after which she stooped down and drew 3 circles round them with a golden rod, touched each of them thrice with her wand, and sprinkled the liquid over both. Gradually the queen's big features began to grow smaller, and her face fresher, while at the same time the dwarf became about twice as tall as he had been before. This sight, added to the blue flames which sprang from the 3 circles, so frightened the queen that she fainted in her chair, and when she recovered, both the page and the fairy had vanished. At first she felt vaguely puzzled, not remembering clearly what had happened. Then it all came back to her, and jumping up, she ran to the nearest mirror. Oh, how happy she was! Her long nose and her projecting teeth had become things of beauty. Her hair was thick and curly and bright gold. The fairy had indeed fulfilled her promise, but in her hurry and pleasure the queen never noticed that she had not been changed into a beautiful young lady, but into a very tall little girl of 8 or 9 years old. Instead of her magnificent velvet dress edged with fur and embroidered in gold, she wore a straight muslin frock with a little lace apron, while her hair, which was always combed and twisted and fastened with diamond pins, hung in curls down her back. But if she had only known, something besides this had befallen her, for except as regards her love for the King of the Green Isles, her mind, as well as her face, had become that of a child, and this her courtiers were aware of, if she was not. Of course they could not imagine what had occurred, and did not know how to behave themselves, till the chief minister set them the example by ordering his wife and daughters to copy the queen's clothes and way of speaking. Then, in a short time, the whole court, including the men, talked and dressed like children, and played with dolls or little tin soldiers, while at the state dinners nothing was seen but iced fruits or sweet cakes made in the shape of birds and horses. But whatever she might be doing, the queen hardly ceased talking about the King of the Green Isles, whom she always spoke of as my little husband. And as weeks passed on and he did not come, she began to get very cross and impatient, so that her courtiers kept away from her as much as they could. By this time, too, they were growing tired of pretending to be children, and whispered their intention of leaving the palace and taking service under a neighboring sovereign, when one day a loud blast of trumpets announced the arrival of the long-expected guest. In an instant all was smiles again, and in spite of the strictest rules of court etiquette, the queen insisted on receiving the young king at the bottom of the stairs. Unfortunately, in her haste, she fell over her dress and rolled down several steps, screaming like a child from fright. She was not really much hurt, though she had scratched her nose and bruised her forehead, but she was obliged to be carried to her room and have her face bathed in cold water. Still, in spite of this, she gave strict orders that the king should be brought to her presence the moment he entered the palace. A shrill blast outside her door sent a twinge of pain through the queen's head, which by this time was aching badly. But in her joy at welcoming her future husband, she paid no heed to it. Between 2 lines of courtiers, bowing low, the young king advanced quickly, but at the sight of the queen and her bandages broke out into such violent fits of laughter that he was forced to leave the room and even the palace. When the queen had recovered from the vexation caused by the king's rude behavior, she bade her attendants to hasten after him and fetch him back, but no promises or entreaties would persuade him to return. This, of course, made the queen's temper even worse than it was before, and a plot was set on foot to deprive her of her crown, which would certainly have succeeded had not the fairy Gangana, who had only wished to prevent her marriage, restored her to her proper shape. But, far from thanking her friend for this service, the sight of her old face in the mirror filled her with despair, and from that day she hated Gangana with a deadly hatred. And where were Pataldo's children all this while? Why, in the island of Bambini, where they had playfellows in their heart's content, and plenty of fairies to take care of them all. But out of all the 7 princes and princesses whom the queen had seen carried off through the window, there was only Karabasz who was good and obedient. The other 6 were so rude and quarrelsome that they could get no one to play with them, and at last, as a punishment, the fairy changed them all into marionettes, till they should learn to behave better. Now, in an unlucky moment, the Fairy of the Fields determined to visit her friend the Queen of the Fairies, who lived in a distant island, in order to consult her as to what was to become of Karabasz. As she was entering the hall of audience, Gangana was leaving it, and sharp words were exchanged between them. After her enemy had flown off in a rage, the Fairy of the Fields poured out the whole story of Gangana's wickedness to the Queen, and implored her counsel. "Be comforted," answered the Fairy Queen. "For a while she must work her will, and at this moment she is carrying off Kadachan to the island where she still holds her niece captive. But should she make an evil use of the power she has, her punishment will be swift and great. And now I will give you this precious phial. Guard it carefully, for the liquid it contains will cause you to become invisible and safe from the piercing eyes of all fairies, and against the eyes of mortals it has no charm." With a heart somewhat lighter, the Fairy of the Fields returned to her own island, and, the better to protect the 6 new marionettes from the wicked fairy, she sprinkled them with a few drops of the liquid, only avoiding just the tips of their noses so that she might be able to know them again. Then she set off for the kingdom of Pataldo, which she found in a state of revolt because, for the first time since he had ascended the throne, he had dared to impose a tax. Indeed, matters might have ended in a war or in cutting off the king's head had not the fairy discovered a means of contenting everybody, and of whispering anew to the queen that all was well with her children, for she dared not tell her of the loss of Kadachan. And what had become of Kadachan? Well, the Fairy of the Fields had found out, by means of her books, which had told her that the poor little boy had been placed by Gangana in an enchanted island round which flowed a rapid river, sweeping rocks and trees in its current. Besides the river, the island was guarded by 24 enormous dragons, breathing flames and forming a rampart of fire, which it seemed as if none could pass. The Fairy of the Fields knew all this, but she had a brave heart, and determined that by some means or other she would overcome all obstacles and rescue Kadachan from the power of Gangana. So, taking with her the water of invisibility, she sprinkled it over her, and mounting her favorite winged lizard, set out for the island. When it appeared in sight, she wrapped herself in her fireproof mantle. Then, bidding the lizard return home, she slipped past the dragons and entered the island. Scarcely had she done so than she beheld Gangana approaching her, talking loudly and angrily to a genius who flew by her side. From what she said, the fairy learned that Pataldo's mother, the old queen, had died of rage on hearing of the marriage of the king of the Green Isles to a young and lovely bride, and instead of leaving her kingdom to Gangana, had bequeathed it to one of the children of her son Pataldo. "But all the trouble I have had with that foolish old woman shall not go for nothing," cried Gangana. "Go at once to my stables and fetch out the strongest and swiftest griffins you can find in the stalls, and harness them to the yellow coach. Drive this with all the speed you may to the Isle of Bambini, and carry off the 6 children of Pataldo that are still there. I will see to Pataldo and Galette myself. When I have got them all safe here, I will change the parents into rabbits and the children into dogs. As for Kadachan, I have not quite made up my mind what I shall do with him." The Fairy of the Fields did not wait to hear more. No time was to be lost in seeking the help of the Fairy Queen if Pataldo and his family were to be saved from this dreadful doom. So, without waiting to summon her lizard, she flew across the island and past the dragons till her feet once more touched the ground again. But at that instant a black cloud rolled over her. Loud thunder rent the air, and the earth rocked beneath her. Then wild lightnings lit up the sky, and by their flashes she saw the 24 dragons fighting together, uttering shrieks and yells, till the whole earth must have heard the uproar. Trembling with terror, the fairy stood rooted to the spot, and when day broke, island, torrent, and dragons had vanished, and in their stead was a barren rock. On the summit of the rock stood a black ostrich, and on his back were seated Kadachan and the little niece of the fairy Gangana, for whose sake she had committed so many evil deeds. While the Fairy of the Fields was gazing in surprise at this strange sight, the ostrich spread its wings and flew off in the direction of the Fortunate Isle, and, followed unseen by the good fairy, entered the great hall where the queen was sitting on her throne. Proud and exultant was Gangana in her new shape, for, By all the laws of fairydom, if she succeeded in laying Kadachan at the feet of the queen, and received him back from her, he was in her power for life, and she might do with him as she would. This the good fairy knew well, and pressed on with all her strength, for the dreadful events of the night had almost exhausted her. But with a mighty effort she snatched the children away from the back of the ostrich, and placed them on the lap of the queen. With a scream of baffled rage the ostrich turned away, and Gangana stood in her place, waiting for the doom which she had brought upon herself. "You have neglected all my warnings," said the queen, speaking more sternly than any fairy had ever heard her, "and my sentence is that during 200 years you will lose all your privileges as a fairy, and under the form of an ostrich shall become the slave of the lowest and wickedest of the genii whom you have made your friends. As for these children, I shall keep them with me, and they shall be brought up at my court." And so they were, until they grew up and were old enough to be married. Then the Fairy of the Fields took them back to the kingdom of the old queen, where Petalda was now reigning. But the cares of state proved too heavy both for him and Galat, after the quiet life they had led for so many years, and they were rejoiced to be able to lay aside their crowns and place them on the heads of Kadachan and his bride, who was as good as she was beautiful, though she was the niece of the wicked Gangana. And so well had Kadachan learned the lesson taught him at the court of the fairy queen, that never since the kingdom was a kingdom had the people been so well governed or happy. And they went about the streets and the fields, smiling with joy at the difference between the old times and the new, and whispering softly to each other, "Everything comes to him who knows how to wait." From Le Cabinet des Fées. End of chapter 28. Recording by Joyce Martin.
Chapter 29 of the Olive Fairy Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jing. The Olive Fairy Book by Andrew Lan. The Silent Princess. Once upon a time there lived in Turkey a pasha who had only one son, and so dearly did he love this boy that he let him spend the whole day amusing himself instead of learning how to be useful like his friends. Now the boy's favorite toy was a golden ball, and with this he would play from morning till night without troubling anybody. One day, as he was sitting in the summer house in the garden, making his ball run all along the walls and catching it again, he noticed an old woman with an earthen pitcher coming to draw water from a well which stood in the corner of the garden. In a moment he had caught his ball and flung it straight at the pitcher, which fell to the ground in 1,000 pieces. The old woman started with surprise, but said nothing, only turned round to fetch another pitcher, and as soon as she had disappeared, the boy hurried out to pick up his ball. Scarcely was he back in the summer house when he beheld the old woman a second time, approaching the well with the pitcher on her shoulder. She had just taken hold of the handle to lower it into the water when crash! And the pitcher lay in fragments at her feet. Of course she felt very angry, but for fear of the pasha, she still held her peace, and spent her last pence in buying a fresh pitcher. But when this also was broken by a blow from the ball, her wrath burst forth, and shaking her fist towards the summer house where the boy was hiding, she cried, "I wish you may be punished by falling in love with the silent princess." And having said this, she vanished. For some time the boy paid no heed to her words. Indeed, he forgot them altogether. But as years went by, and he began to think more about things, the remembrance of the old woman's wish came back to his mind. Who is the silent princess? And why should it be a punishment to fall in love with her? He asked himself, and received no answer. However, that did not prevent him from putting the question again and again, till at length he grew so weak and ill that he could eat nothing, and in the end was forced to lie in bed altogether. His father the Pasha became so frightened by this strange disease that he sent for every physician in the kingdom to cure him, but no one was able to find a remedy. "How did your illness first begin, my son?" asked the Pasha one day. "Perhaps, if we knew that, we should also know better what to do for you." Then the youth told him what had happened all those years before, when he was a little boy, and what the old woman had said to him. "Give me, I pray you," he cried, when his tale was finished, "give me, I pray you, leave to go into the world in search of the princess, and perhaps this evil state may cease." And, sore through his heart was to part from his only son, the Pasha felt that the young man would certainly die if he remained at home any longer. "Go, and peace be with you," he answered, and went out to call his trusted steward, whom he ordered to accompany his young master. Their preparations were soon made, and early one morning the two set out. But neither old man nor young had the slightest idea where they were going, or what they were undertaking. First they lost their way in a dense forest, and from that they at length emerged in a wilderness, where they wandered for 6 months, not seeing a living creature, and finding scarcely anything to eat or drink, till they became nothing but skin and bone, while their garments hung in tatters about them. They had forgotten all about the princess, and their only wish was to find themselves back in the palace again, when one day they discovered that they were standing on the shoulder of a mountain. The stones beneath them shone as brightly as diamonds, and both their hearts beat with joy at beholding a tiny old man approaching them. The sight awoke all manners of recollections. The numb feeling that had taken possession of them fell away as if by magic, and it was with glad voices that they greeted the newcomer. "Where are we, my friend?" asked they. And the old man told them that this was the mountain where the sultan's daughter sat, covered by 7 veils, and the shining of the stones was only the reflection of her own brilliance. On hearing this news, all the dangers and difficulties of their past wandering vanished from their minds. "How can I reach her soonest?" asked the youth eagerly, but the old man only answered, "Have patience, my son, yet a while. Another 6 months must go by before you arrive at the palace where she dwells with the rest of the women. And even so, think well when you can, as should you fail to make her speak, you will have to pay forfeit with your life, as others have done. So beware." But the prince only laughed at this counsel, as others had also done. After 3 months, they found themselves on the top of another mountain, and the prince saw with surprise that its sides were colored a beautiful red. Perched on some cliffs, not far off, was a small village, and the prince proposed to his friend that they should go and rest there. The villagers, on their part, welcomed them gladly, and gave them food to eat and beds to sleep on, and thankful indeed were the 2 travelers to repose their weary limbs. The next morning they asked their host if he could tell them whether there were still many days' journey from the princess, and whether he knew why the mountain was so much redder than other mountains. "For 3½ more months you must still pursue your way," answered he, "and by that time you will find yourselves at the gate of the princess' palace. As for the color of the mountain, that comes from the soft hue of her cheeks and mouth, which shines through the 7 veils which cover her. But none have ever beheld her face, for she sits there, uttering no word, though one hears whispers of many having lost their lives for her sake." The prince, however, would listen no further, and thanking the man for his kindness, he jumped up, and with the steward set out to climb the mountain. On and on and on they went, sleeping under the trees or in caves, and living upon berries and any fish they could catch in the rivers. But at length, when their clothes were nearly in rags, and their legs so tired that they could hardly walk any further, they saw on the top of the next mountain a palace of yellow marble. "There it is, at last!" cried the prince, and fresh blood seemed to spring in his veins. But as he and his companion began to climb towards the top, they paused in horror, for the ground was white with dead men's skulls. It was the prince who first recovered his voice, and he said to his friend, as carelessly as he could, "These must be the skulls of the men who tried to make the princess speak and failed. Well, if we fail too, our bones will strew the ground likewise." "Oh, turn back now, my prince, while there is yet time," entreated his companion. "Your father gave you into my charge, but when we set out I did not know that certain death lay before us." "Take heart, oh Lala, take heart," answered the prince. "A man can but die once. And besides, the princess will have to speak some day, you know." So they went on again, past the skulls and dead men's bones in all degrees of whiteness, and by they reached another village, where they determined to rest for a little while, so that their wits might be fresh and bright for the task that lay before them. But this time, though the people were kind and friendly, their faces were gloomy, and every now and then woeful cries would rend the air. "Oh, my brother, have I lost you?" "Oh, my son, shall I see you no more?" And then, as the prince and his companion asked the meaning of these laments, which indeed was plain enough, the answer was given. "Ah, you also have come hither to die. This town belongs to the father of the princess, and when any rash man seeks to move the princess to speech, he must first obtain leave of the sultan. If that is granted him, he is then led into the presence of the princess. What happens afterwards? Perhaps the sight of these bones may help you to guess." The young man bowed his head in token of thanks, and stood thoughtful for a short time. Then, turning to the Lala, he said, "Well, our destiny will soon be decided. Meanwhile, we will find out all we can, and do nothing rashly." For 2 or 3 days they wandered about the bazaars, keeping their eyes and ears open, when, one morning, they met a man carrying a nightingale in a cage. The bird was singing so joyously that the prince stopped to listen, and at once offered to buy him from his owner. "Oh, why cumber yourself with such a useless thing?" cried the Lala in disgust. "Have you not enough to occupy your hands and mind without taking an extra burden?" But the prince, who liked having his own way, paid no heed to him, and paying the high price asked by the man, he carried the bird back to the inn, and hung him up in his chamber. That evening, as he was sitting alone, trying to think of something that would make the princess talk, and failing altogether, the nightingale pecked open her cage door, which was lightly fastened by a stick, and, perching on his shoulder, murmured softly in his ear, "What makes you so sad, my prince?" The young man started. In his native country birds did not talk, and, like many people, he was always rather afraid of what he did not understand. But in a moment he felt ashamed of his folly, and explained that he had travelled for more than a year, and over thousands of miles, to win the hand of the sultan's daughter. And now that he had reached his goal, he could think of no plan to force her to speak. "Oh, do not trouble your head about that," replied the bird. "It is quite easy. Go this evening to the women's apartments, and take me with you, and, when you enter the princess' private chamber, hide me under the pedestal which supports the great golden candlestick. The princess herself will be wrapped so thickly in her 7 veils that she can see nothing, neither can her face be seen by anyone. Then inquire after her health, but she will remain quite silent, and next say that you are so sorry to have disturbed her that you will have a little talk with the pedestal of the candlestick. When you speak, I will answer." The prince threw his mantle over the bird and started for the palace, where he begged an audience of the sultan. This was soon granted him, and leaving the nightingale hidden by the mantle, in a dark corner outside the door, he walked up to the throne on which his highness was sitting, and bowed low before him. "What is your request?" asked the Sultan, looking closely at the young man, who was tall and handsome, but when he heard the tale, he shook his head pityingly. "If you can make her speak, she shall be your wife," answered he. "But if not, did you mark the skulls that strewed the mountainside?" "Some day a man is bound to break the spell, O Sultan," replied the youth boldly, "and why should not I be as well as another? At any rate, my word is pledged, and I cannot draw back now." "Well, go if you must," said the Sultan, and he bade his attendants lead the way to the chamber of the princess, but to allow the young man to enter alone. Catching up, unseen, his mantle and the cage as they passed into the dark corridor, for by this time night was coming on, the youth found himself standing in a room bare except for a pile of silken cushions, and one tall golden candlestick. His heart beat high as he looked at the cushions, and knew that, shrouded within the shining veils that covered them, lay the much longed for princess. Then, fearful that, after all, other eyes might be watching him, he hastily placed the nightingale under the open pedestal on which the candlestick was resting, and turning again he steadied his voice, and besought the princess to tell him of her well-being. Not by even a movement of her hand did the princess show that she had heard, and the young man, who of course expected this, went on to speak of his travels, and of the strange countries he had passed through. But not a sound broke the silence. "I see clearly that you are interested in none of these things," said he at last, "and as I have been forced to hold my peace for so many months, I feel that now I really must talk to somebody, so I shall go and address my conversation to the candlestick." And with that he crossed the room behind the princess, and cried, "Oh, fairest of candlesticks, how are you?" "Very well indeed, my lord," answered the nightingale. "But I wonder how many years have gone by since any one had spoken with me. And now that you have come, rest, I pray you, a while, and listen to my story." "Willingly," replied the youth, curling himself up on the floor, for there was no cushion for him to sit on. "Once upon a time," began the nightingale, "there lived a pasha whose daughter was the most beautiful maiden in the whole kingdom. Suitors she had in plenty, but she was not easy to please, and at length there were only 3 whom she felt she could even think of marrying. Not knowing which of the 3 she liked best, she took counsel with her father, who summoned the young men into his presence, and then told them that they must each of them learn some trade, and whichever of them proved the cleverest at the end of 6 months should become the husband of the princess. Though the 3 suitors may have been secretly disappointed, they could not help feeling that this test was quite fair, and left the palace together, talking as they went of what handicrafts they might set themselves to follow. The day was hot, and when they reached the spring that gushed out of the side of the mountain, they stopped to drink and rest, and then one of them said, 'It will be best that we should each seek our fortunes alone, so let us put our rings under the stone and go our separate ways. And the first one who returns hither will take his ring, and the others will take theirs. Thus we shall know whether we have all fulfilled the commands of the pasha, or if some accident has befallen any of us.' 'Good,' replied the other 2, and 3 rings were placed in a little hole and carefully covered again by the stone. Then they parted, and for 6 months they knew naught of each other, till, on the day appointed, they met at the spring. Right glad they all were, and eagerly they talked of what they had done and how the time had been spent. 'I think I shall win the princess,' said the eldest, with a laugh, 'for it is not everybody that is able to accomplish a whole year's journey in an hour.' 'That is very clever, certainly,' answered his friend, 'but if you are to govern a kingdom, it may be still more useful to have the power of seeing what is happening at a distance. And that is what I have learned,' replied the second. 'No, no, my dear comrades,' cried the third, 'your trades are all very well, but when the pasha hears that I can bring back the dead to life, he will know which of us 3 is to be his son-in-law. But come, there only remain a few hours of the 6 months he granted us. It is time that we hastened back to the palace." "Stop a moment," said the second. "It would be well to know what is going on in the palace." And plucking some small leaves from a tree near by, he muttered some words and made some signs, and laid them on his eyes. In an instant he turned pale, and uttered a cry. "What is it? What is it?" exclaimed the others, and, with a shaking voice, he gasped, "The princess is lying on her bed, and has barely a few minutes to live. Oh, can no one save her?" "I can," answered the third, taking a small box from his turban. "This ointment will cure any illness, but how to reach her in time?" "Give it to me," said the first, and he wished himself by the bedside of the princess, which was surrounded by the sultan and his weeping courtiers. Clearly there was not a second to lose, for the princess had grown unconscious, and her face cold. Plunging his finger into the ointment, he touched her eyes, mouth, and ears with the paste, and with beating heart awaited the result. It was swifter than he supposed. As he looked, the color came back into her cheeks, and she smiled up at her father. The sultan, almost speechless with joy at this sudden change, embraced his daughter tenderly, and then turned to the young man to whom he owed her life. "Are you not one of those 3 whom I sent forth to learn a trade 6 months ago?" asked he, and the young man answered yes, and that the other 2 were even now on their way to the palace, so that the sultan might judge between them. At this point in his story the nightingale stopped, and asked the prince which of the 3 he thought had the best right to the princess. "The one who had learned how to prepare the ointment," replied he. "But if it had not been for the man who could see what was happening at a distance, they would never have known that the princess was ill," said the nightingale. "I would give it to him." And the strife between them waxed hot, till suddenly the listening princess started up from her cushions and cried, "Oh, you fools! Cannot you understand that if it had not been for him who had power to reach the palace in time, the ointment itself would have been useless, for death would have claimed her? It is he and no other who ought to have the princess." At the first sound of the prince's voice, a slave, who was standing at the door, ran at full speed to tell the sultan of the miracle which had taken place, and the delighted father hastened to the spot. But by this time the princess perceived that she had fallen into a trap which had been cunningly laid for her, and would not utter another word. All she could be prevailed on to do was to make signs to her father that the man who wished to be her husband must induce her to speak 3 times. And she smiled to herself beneath her 7 veils as she thought of the impossibility of that. When the sultan told the prince that though he had succeeded once, he would have twice to pass through the same test, the young man's face clouded over. It did not seem to him fair play, but he dared not object, so he only bowed low, and contrived to step back close to the spot where the nightingale was hidden. As it was now quite dark, he tucked unseen the little cage under his cloak, and left the palace. "Why are you so gloomy?" asked the nightingale, as soon as they were safely outside. "Everything has gone exactly right. Of course the princess was very angry with herself for having spoken, and did you see that, at her first words, the veils that covered her began to rend? Take me back tomorrow evening, and place me on the pillar by the lattice. Fear nothing, you have only to trust to me." The next evening, towards sunset, the prince left the cage behind him, and with the bird in the folds of his garment slipped into the palace, and made his way straight to the princess' apartments. He was at once admitted by the slaves who guarded the door, and took care to pass near the window, so that the nightingale hopped unseen to the top of a pillar. Then he turned and bowed low to the princess, and asked her several questions. But as before she answered nothing, and indeed gave no sign that she heard. After a few minutes the young man bowed again, and crossing over to the window he said, "Oh, pillar, it is no use speaking to the princess. She will not utter one word, and as I must talk to somebody, I have come to you. Tell me how you have been all this long while." I thank you, replied a voice from the pillar. I'm feeling very well, and it is lucky for me that the princess is silent, or else you would not have wanted to speak to me. To reward you, I will relate to you an interesting tale that I lately overheard, and about which I should like to have your opinion. That will be charming, answered the prince. So pray begin at once. Once upon a time, said the nightingale, there lived a woman who was so beautiful that every man who saw her fell in love with her, but she was very hard to please, and refused to wed any of them, though she managed to keep friends with all. Years passed away in this manner, almost without her noticing them, and one by one the young men grew tired of waiting, and sought wives who may have been less handsome, but were also less proud, and at length only 3 of her former wooers remained, MaryA, MaryA, and MaryA. Still she held herself apart, thought herself better and lovelier than any other women, when, on a certain evening, her eyes were opened at last to the truth. She was sitting before her mirror, combing her curls, when amongst her raven locks she found a long white hair. At this dreadful sight her heart gave a jump and then stood still. I'm growing old, she said to herself, and if I do not choose a husband soon, I shall never get one. I know that either of those men would gladly marry me tomorrow, but I cannot decide between them. I must invent some way to find out which of them is the best, and lose no time about it. So, instead of going to sleep, she thought all night long of different plans, and in the morning she arose and dressed herself. That will have to do, she muttered as she pulled out the white hair which had cost her so much trouble. It is not very good, but I can think of nothing better, and, well, they are none of them clever, and I dare say they will easily fall into the trap. Then she called her slave, and bade her let MaryA know that she would be ready to receive him in an hour's time. After that she went into the garden and dug a grave under a tree, by which she laid a white shroud. MaryA was delighted to get the gracious message, and putting on his newest garments, he hastened to the lady's house, but great was his dismay at finding her stretched on her cushions, weeping bitterly. "What is the matter, O fair one?" he asked, bowing low before her. "A terrible thing has happened," said she, her voice choked with sobs. "My father died 2 nights ago, and I buried him in my garden, but now I find that he was a wizard, and was not dead at all, for his grave is empty, and he is wandering about somewhere in the world." "That is evil news indeed," answered MaryA, "but can I do nothing to comfort you?" "There's one thing you can do," replied she, "and that is to wrap yourself in the shroud and lay yourself in the grave. If he should not return till after 3 hours have elapsed, he will have lost his power over me, and be forced to go and wander elsewhere." Now MaryA was proud of the trust deposed in him, and wrapping himself in the shroud, he stretched himself at full length in the grave. After some time, MaryA arrived in his turn, and found the lady groaning and lamenting. She told him that her father had been a wizard, and that in case, as was very likely, he should wish to leave his grave and come to work her evil, MaryA was to take a stone and be ready to crush in his head if he showed signs of moving. MaryA, enchanted at being able to do his lady a service, picked up a stone and seated himself by the side of the grave wherein lay MaryA. Meanwhile, the hour arrived in which MaryA was accustomed to pay his respects, and, as in the case of the other 2, he discovered the lady overcome with grief. To him she said that a wizard who was an enemy of her father's had thrown the dead man out of his grave and had taken his place. "But," she added, "if you can bring the wizard into my presence, all his power will go from him. If not, then I am lost." "Ah, lady, what is there that I would not do for you?" cried MaryA, and running down to the grave, he seized the astonished MaryA by the waist, and flinging the body over his shoulder, he hastened with him into the house. At the first moment, MaryA was so surprised at this turn of affairs, for which the lady had not prepared him, that he sat still and did nothing. But by and by he sprang up and hurled the stone after the 2 flying figures, hoping that it might kill them both. Fortunately, it touched neither, and soon all three were in the presence of the lady. Then Jagdschi, thinking that he had delivered her from the power of the wizard, slid off the back of Firedschi and threw the shroud from him. "Tell me, my prince," said the nightingale, when he had finished his story, "which of the three men deserved to win the lady? I myself should choose Firedschi." "No, no," answered the prince, who understood the wink the bird had given him. "It was Baldschi who took the most trouble, and it was certainly he who deserved the lady." But the nightingale would not agree, and they began to quarrel till a third voice broke in. "How can you talk such nonsense?" cried the princess, and as she spoke a sound of tearing was heard. "Why, you have never even thought of Jagdschi, who lay for 3 hours in the grave with a stone held over his head. Of course it was he whom the lady chose for her husband." It was not many minutes before the news reached the sultan, but even now he would not consent to the marriage till his daughter had spoken a third time. On hearing this, the young man took counsel with the nightingale how best to accomplish this, and the bird told him that as the princess, in her fury at having fallen into the snare laid for her, had ordered the pillar to be broken in pieces, he must be hidden in the folds of a curtain that hung by the door. The following evening, the prince entered the palace, and walked boldly up to the princess' apartments. As he entered, the nightingale flew from under his arm and perched himself on top of the door, where he was entirely concealed by the folds of the dark curtain. The young man talked as usual to the princess without obtaining a single word in reply, and at length he left her lying under the heap of shining veils, now rent in many places, and crossed the room towards the door, from which came a voice that gladly answered him. For a while the two talked together. Then the nightingale asked if the prince was fond of stories, as he had lately heard one which interested and perplexed him greatly. In reply, the prince begged that he might hear it at once, and without further delay the nightingale began. "Once upon a time, a carpenter, a tailor, and a student set out together to see the world. After wandering about for some months, they grew tired of travelling, and resolved to stay and rest in a small town that took their fancy. So they hired a little house and looked about for work to do, returning at sunset to smoke their pipes and talk over the events of the day. One night in the middle of summer it was hotter than usual, and the carpenter found himself unable to sleep. Instead of tossing about on his cushions, making himself more uncomfortable than he was already, the man wisely got up and drank some coffee and lit his long pipe. Suddenly his eye fell on some pieces of wood in a corner, and, being very clever with his fingers, he had soon set up a perfect statue of a girl about 14 years old. This so pleased and quieted him that he grew quite drowsy, and going back to bed fell fast asleep. But the carpenter was not the only person who lay awake that night. Thunder was in the air, and the tailor became so restless that he thought he would go downstairs and cool his feet in the little fountain outside the garden door. To reach the door he had to pass through the room where the carpenter had sat and smoked, and against the wall he beheld standing a beautiful girl. He stood speechless for an instant before he ventured to touch her hand, when, to his amazement, he found that she was fashioned out of wood. "Ah, I can make you more beautiful still," said he, and fetching from a shelf a roll of yellow silk, which he had bought that day from a merchant, he cut and draped and stitched, till at length a lovely robe clothed the slender figure. When this was finished, the restlessness had departed from him, and he went back to bed. As dawn approached, the student arose and prepared to go to the mosque with the first ray of sunlight. But when he saw the maiden standing there, he fell on his knees and lifted his hands in ecstasy. "Oh, thou art fairer than the evening air, clad in the beauty of 10,000 stars," he murmured to himself. "Surely a form so rare was never meant to live without a soul." And forthwith he prayed with all his might that life should be breathed into it. And his prayer was heard, and the beautiful statue became a living girl, and the three men all fell in love with her, and each desired to have her for wife. "Now," said the nightingale, "to which of them did the maiden really belong? It seems to me that the carpenter had the best right to her." "Oh, but the student would never have thought of praying that she might be given a soul had not the tailor drawn attention to her loveliness by the robe which he put upon her," answered the prince, who guessed what he was expected to say, that they soon set up quite a pretty quarrel. Suddenly the princess, furious that neither of them alluded to the part played by the student, quite forgot her vow of silence, and cried loudly, "Idiots that you are! How could she belong to any one but the student? If it had not been for him, all that the others did would have gone for nothing. Of course it was he who married the maiden." And as she spoke the 7 veils fell from her, and she stood up, the fairest princess that the world has ever seen. "You have won me," she said smiling, holding out her hand to the prince. And so they were married, and after the wedding feast was over, they sent for the old woman whose pitcher the prince had broken so long ago, and she dwelt in the palace, and became nurse to their children, and lived happily till she died. End of The Silent Princess. End of The Olive Fairy Book by Andrew Lan.